Before I start, just let me thank you for the invitation to be here. And also let me say that it's great to see such a young industry to rise up and actually have support. Because I see like Poland several years ago when we also just started. And I hope that we've proven that countries like us from Central Europe can actually make some waves in the world. So, my name is Stan Just. My full name is Stanislav Viktor Just. I'm from Poland. I'm an R&D manager at CD Projekt Red. And I wanted to start with a small trailer. Somehow play it. No? Alright, a couple of words about myself. I'm a psychologist, organizational psychologist by trade. I've studied in Krakow, then I moved to Warsaw to do my Master's of Business and Administration Studies. And I about a dozen So, what I'm talking about today is the difficulties that we had while doing Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, especially the character art thing, because I managed several departments, but character art is one of my favorites. So mostly not about the successes, but about the difficulties and how we tried to deal with those difficulties during the production. Let's start by setting up some background. Like CD Projekt in the 90s, it gathered some funds by distributing games, not pirating games, but distributing legal games from the web. And those funds were dedicated then in creating The Witcher 1. So we started in 2002, we released in 2007, so it took a lot of time to actually develop. And it was a success. It was released only on the PC. It was enough success to actually fund The Witcher 2, and then Witcher 2 was released on PC and Xbox 360, and then we had enough funds to release Witcher 3, but the expectancies on the quality level were rising. So the first one was 83, let's say, the second one 87, 88, so we wanted to hit over 90 with The Witcher 3. And that was very, very difficult to achieve, and that was something that was very important during the production, because if we have a goal like that, so just notice that we haven't had a goal to like fit the budget or fit the timeline. We had the goal of hitting the over 90 review score, and that actually was crucial for our decision making later in the process. So how we were organized, each and every team in CD Projekt Red is being led by two people, so a producer and a lead. Producer is responsible for budgeting, for time, and the lead is responsible for quality. We had several artists, concept artists, 10 3D modelers, a dedicated QA, and a dedicated tech artist within the character department itself. So we were making models, mainly monsters and characters for the game, something that is organic, not environment art in this regard. Okay, so our internal process pipeline started always with the story, so we needed to know what we are trying to deliver, what
our screenwriters wrote and what kind of a monster, what kind of a character are we supposed to do. Then my job was to list each and every item that we need to do, that our team needs to do, and then prioritizing it, listing the time that's required to actually do it. Sometimes we had some more elaborative briefs, some documents, like for example, if we have monsters, we need to actually get more elaborative description of how he will be fighting, whether he will spit or not, whether he needs a long tongue or a short one. But sometimes there was a quest item of making a dirty spoon, and that was it. That was the whole description of the item. Then we moved to concepting, modeling, tech pass, and QA, and that is only our internal process within this department. So a very important thing to note that this process is just a part of the bigger pipeline, always within the game. So for example, if you're making a quest or if you're making a monster, character art is just a part of the whole pipeline that you need to follow. Now, I've tried to list all the categories of items. One went down, I don't know why, because we don't have fonts here, appropriate ones at least. So all those items categorized and put into spreadsheets. Each category was put on a spreadsheet and had multiple items, some of them even hundreds, that we needed to track and list. And question for you guys, which category would you do first? Because I've asked this question to my leads and directors when I joined CD Projekt 3 years ago, and I received a various answer. But I am curious, what would you start from? Do you have any ideas? The first one, main characters. Why? Because it's main, right? It's most important. And sometimes I did receive such an answer, and that's a rather intuitive thing actually to start with, and is wrong, in my opinion, because it doesn't take into account the overall pipeline that you need to follow later on. So we learned that by of course making a mistake and starting from this, but what we improved on the expansion packs is that we started with monsters and animals. Why? Because they, after our work, after character art, they need to be passed to animators, to sound designers, to VFX artists, and the pipeline is much longer than in, for example, main characters or crowds, because it's much easier to placeholder them. So you can put a placeholder on a quest, it will be rather the same. So it won't require, for example, a special rig or special animations most of the time. That's why you don't need to start with them. But I will comment each and every, or almost each of those categories, because within each of them we learned something, and we made a lot of mistakes while doing so, and that's why we also postpone our releases. So let's start with main characters. What's the difference between main character and the crowd character? Well, the difference is that the first one needs to be very specific. It doesn't need to have a different body. It doesn't need to have a different rig. It just needs to be specific in a way that you can distinguish him from the crowd. So how you do it? Well, you can do it by clothes, by hair, and by face. That's like 3 main things that you can do. But there are consequences of having such a unique character and having more of them than just one. I hope it will play. Yeah. So there are at least 2 consequences that you need to consider. First consequence is that if you're sharing the same animation set between crowd characters and a special character, and you're getting the guy a coat or a long jacket, you can see that there will be some problems, for example, with clipping. That's the first category. So clipping is a situation when you're intersecting, your geometry is intersecting in some way. So for example, this guy is standing up and his hand is pierced in his leg. So usually on the gameplay, you wouldn't care because it's fast, it's quick, it's actually like the people are focusing on the face, not on the hand. So it's something that we could ignore. But since we have 1,500 dialogue sequences, and with close-ups, you can see that it is a bug, and that is a bug that you should actually address in some way. So we did that. We tried to address those issues in two ways. First way is to cheat, just to change the shot, so the camera angle, so that we don't show clipping. So that's one of the most regular cheating that we did on the dialogues. And the second one was a custom technology that we made. It was to give the possibility to the animators to actually adjust each and every bone within the body, so that without creating another animation of standing up, an animator could actually pick the hand bone and just move it, offset it a little bit, without creating another asset. That was extremely important for us because we were hitting the upper border of Blu-ray disc, and we couldn't actually create a lot of copies of assets, like for example animations. So we needed to find a way how to cheat the system and use the same amount of assets but adjust it in a certain way. That's one thing. And the second thing was that since they have special clothes, since they have special faces and hair, it's very heavy on the performance side. So for example, if you have a scene of a funeral, and on the funeral usually very important people show up, and all of those unique characters are being accumulated in one space, you're not reusing assets, because each and every one needs to be specific, because that's their purpose. That's their purpose of being a main character. But then you're not reusing assets, so a lot of assets are being loaded up in the memory. So it is very important just to control that and to be aware of those consequences when they hit. You have a very huge problems actually in optimizing the game. All right, let's move further. Monsters and animals. Here, a funny thing happened because we did the third installment of the game. When you're doing it, you usually have assets from the first or from the second game. And the temptation here, especially on the production side, on my side, is to reuse those assets. Because either you will do a model for like 4 or 6 weeks from the scratch, or you can take the old model and you're more or less done, or you can improve it in 1 week. Like the difference is very significant. So this is an example of a model that we tried to do some lifting with, and we ended up with something like that for one of the E3s. So it took about a week to actually upgrade the textures, and maybe a few days more to do the hair. And he was also morphable, so he we're buffing up a little bit in one of the E3's demos. But still we haven't been fully satisfied with the result. And then, so we spent one and a half, let's say 2 weeks on this model. And then, since we weren't satisfied, we scratched that and spent 6 weeks of making it from the scratch. So at the end, we spent 8 weeks on something that we could actually do in 6 weeks, just because we wanted to save time. So see the irony in this. You want to save time, but you actually spend more time in doing something that is right. And why? Because you're aiming at a quality bar. You're not aiming at the budget, you're not aiming at the time, you're aiming at the quality bar. And if this quality bar isn't met in this regard, then you need to actually spend even more time and hit it. That's one tip. And the second tip is, that we also learned the hard way, is to think about dangling and movable elements on your character when you're concepting it. That's the mistake that we did doing the base game. We were so focused on concepting models and monsters that we weren't thinking about what will be moving on them, what will be the dangling element, what will be on the apex. And you can see that many, for example, Geralt's armor, the main character's armor, in the base game are rather flat and not movable a lot. But we try to improve on that. I will touch that later on. We tried to improve on that in the expansion packs, because you can see how those moving elements actually add life to the character. All right? Quest component characters. If you're doing a complex game that requires hundreds of quests, you usually need something to be specific in each quest. And how you should do it, since you don't have enough resources, even we don't have enough resources to actually create a specific character for every quest. But we did that. We did that by copying the crowd character and just adding them at least one unique item. For example, in this case, this guy has a bandage on his right arm. And this bandage is very unique. It's one of a kind in the whole game. Overall assets on this character is like very, very common. You can see it almost everywhere in the game. But this bandage, it's something very specific, and it was used in the quest. So instead of doing a new character for several weeks, you just need to spend several hours and just tweaking one item that will be put on a crowd character and then used in the narrative, and this way create dozens of unique characters. This is also the way how we approached, for example, this guy. So at some point in the production, very late stages, we were again and again asked by a Living World team, because we have a team dedicated for making the world alive and not doing quests. And they asked us how to do a new fraction, let's say, of cannibals. And we said that we don't have any assets for that. We don't have any time for that. So we applied the same approach. We copied the guy and just copied even the assets that we use in Dismemberment, and just did a necklace in one day. And such assets were reused then again for his peers, and we have a new fraction. That's the easiest way how you can cheat in order to get more assets in a game that are in some way unique. Okay, a challenge that was in the quest component characters and in the commoners was that to make assets that will be as common as possible. That is, for me, that is the same kind of a challenge as in creating a main character. Because in main character, you need to do something crazy that won't be repeatable ever. But in a component character, it is also difficult to create such an asset that will be so common that people won't recognize that it is repeated over and over again. So for example, in my opinion, we completely failed with the knife in the middle of the chest, because it's so unique that you can see that it's being repeated. But some of the vests and pants are so common in the game, but you don't notice it because you just need to change the pattern, change the color, and if it's, for example, plain and brown, it's a peasant. If it's fancy and violet, it's a nobleman. All of a sudden, it's the same asset. And that's also the way how you can cheat in order to create hundreds of characters and different fractions just by applying a specific pattern and a specific color onto the exactly same asset. And you have a lot of components like that. Yeah, so we simply, you can see it on this old movie, how we assemble that in our editor. We just create a lot of plain, simple assets that will be repeatable, and people artists were inclined to actually simply assemble sim-wise, assemble those guys just by picking a different coat, different trousers, different boots, and just coloring them, applying different pattern later on. Very simple way, but it allowed us to create hundreds of different characters. Okay, and performance issue that we stumbled upon while doing crowds was also the question of movable elements. So Apex, Dangles, and Hair, especially, and because Hair shader is the most expensive shader that we have. That's why you can, for example, notice that most of the crowds are using caps. They don't have full-blown hair walking around because it is most expensive. And also some of the decisions, even late in the project, we were thinking about like changing all the skirts, and for example, in the city to Apex and to simulation, but it also was very expensive. And also, for example, earrings. That was something that we considered like adding because it was rather simple for us to add, but also on one side it was expensive, and on the other side it was not visible much. So people didn't notice that the crowd had or didn't have earrings on themselves, so we actually resigned from many of them. Okay, corpses, another category, very fun category to have actually, because in the middle of the production we actually noticed that we are making a game about war. And we noticed it like in a very hard way, because we had a backlog of items of creating like fractions and creating main characters, etc., and monsters, like, oh yeah, we had all of that. And then we started receiving requests for bodies. And bodies, since we need a lot of them, they also need to be optimized. Like, for example, we cut out eyes from each and every one, because eyes also have a very expensive shader, so each and every one of those bodies have the same face and doesn't have eyes. But you don't look at them like from close, so it's okay. But if you were creating like hundreds of fractions, you need to create hundreds of bodies, and all of them need to be optimized. And since they are quite easy to do, but if you have like a 2-hour task and still you have like 200 bodies to make, it still turns out to be quite significant. So we needed to find a way how to do it quickly. So we figured out that almost all of the bodies can be put in like more or less 10 poses. So we figured out 10 poses of dying, and then put each and every body and fraction into this pose. And if you play the game, you can probably fit each and every body within one of those poses. And then just like add blood, add particles, add some weapons. It also hits some animals, unfortunately. Animals didn't have 10 poses because they didn't need as much, but still. Just a lesson from this is just to think when you're considering, for example, a story narrative. When you read in the story that a person is walking around the battlefield and he's meeting a guy, you need to list each and everything that you can see in your imagination. So each and every tree, each and every bird, each and every body, you have to list everything. And that is very important, because you usually come down to, oh yeah, I'm walking battlefield, like main character, quest character, they will be talking to like 2 characters, like 1 animal. No, you need to like be really specific when listing items, because it will come down to this later on when the requests are coming. In our process, quest designers, when they implement quests, they are stumbling upon something that they are missing, and then they are giving requests, for example, for a department like ours. Morphing. We had morphing, so morphing in this regard is just transforming one mesh to another, which had the same density. And this is a feature that we really wanted to have at the very beginning, and it was prototyped in one of the earliest demos. Actually featured a siren that was transforming into flying animal, so it was really cool. But the lesson from that was that we actually spent a lot of time, like months, in developing that feature, only to have that feature, and then it was used several times in the game. Actually, it was used like a dozen times, but nobody noticed it. So the lesson from this is that you really need to be sure that you will be using a feature that is so expensive as, for example, this one, because it might not be as efficient as you imagine. Fortunately, we tried and we did at least a couple of quests that feature that. For example, this guy. What is important here is that we try to cover his transformation as much as possible with editing. So the weather is not clear, so the editing is also not fully showing his transformation in one take, because it's also cheating, because he's not transforming from this little guy to this big guy, but he's transforming to the middle guy and then transforming from the middle guy to the big guy, because it would the little ones would require too much density to have actually transform it nicely. That's why we also were cheating in this regard. Human equipment. That is something that we spent a lot of time in concepting. I mean, the amount of armors that were concepted was so high. You cannot see the pointer, but in this regard, we really needed to consider what will be doable within our technology. So, for example, if you see the coat of like covering Geralt almost completely on the top, it's something that was excluded right after it was drawn, because if you have scenes where when Geralt is like laying back, everything would be intersecting. It won't be simulating correctly. So most of the ideas were just rejected because of not fitting into our standards. So the tip here is to have standards, like to have something that you can realize that you cannot do some puffy shoulder pads, for example. And for example, in the second expansion packs, we had this issue because the team that was doing it and concepting it also, of course, added some fancy shoulder pads that was this big, and we really needed to decrease them several times before it went to the game. So even the artist that was responsible for that said the coolness level decreased. That was his comment in actually doing such adjustments. But thanks to that, we avoided a lot of clipping in the game and a lot of bugs. Then what we did is that we tried to distinguish the silhouettes in the armors, especially in the upgradable ones. And the upgradable armors are something that we spent also a lot of time with, because it was very, very difficult for us to create an armor that would look cool even on the first level, and then add like 3 layers of items on it. So it was quite of a challenge, especially if you consider that players usually see the armors from the back. So if you're concepting an armor, you usually want it to look cool and you put everything on it, and then it turns out that on the back it's like plain simple. And you need to distinguish between levels. And so we started like concepting from the back, and also it's turned out to be quite of a challenge. Then it can be a problem if you create an armor and you spend a lot of time. We spent like 6, sometimes 8 weeks of creating this 4-level item, and then it doesn't look good in the game. So what we did at some point, we tried to use proxy mesh, so translate high poly into a proxy mesh and put it in the game as soon as possible, just to see how it looks, just to see how it feels, and then do some adjustments at the very last phase. So for example, it wasn't that we finished the concept and then went on with the production, but we finished concept, did the high poly, and did the adjustments of the concept, and then we moved further. Okay, and for example, lesson here is that you should actually cut your coat in the back if you're using Apex, because it will be buggy and while riding on a horse, and it will produce a lot of YouTube videos. If you're focusing on the back and your character is wearing a weapon, you should focus on the weapon as well, and you should focus on the scabbard, for example. We even did a small app that actually helped us in creating and mixing all those assets, because you need a pommel and a grip, a different one, and you mix it in an appropriate way to create hundreds of items like that, and they need to look really, really good. So, for example, we had problems with outsource here because they said, well, that's just a small item. It doesn't require huge textures, huge quality. No, that's false. You see it on the screen all the time. Then this thing is like an addition for the human equipment, because we had so many scenes and this game is so story-driven that any bug that will break immersion while, for example, dialogues, was a pain in the ass for us. And sometimes it came down to the decision whether we are doing a color for an armor or not, because the guy will be, you know, looking on the sides while talking, and then there will be intersections, the immersion is gone, and the quality is not met. So we even did a small feature which we called a color system that allowed us to adjust the geometry while moving the head, while having just a sphere of collision there. And this lesson's learned when it comes to the armors. So right now in the base game we would do it with a single plane, and it will fit like to the leg, and will probably skin to the leg, or will have apex, but will be just one plane. In the expansion packs, and this is actually a DLC armor, we already knew that and even concepted that in 2 layers, so that an artist could do that in 2 layers, and our tech pass artist that did the apex actually could do it. And also it has this cut in the back, as you can see. So lessons learned here, so it's cutting in the back, so it's having layers and having movable elements in the armor. All of that was used in the DLCs. Dismemberment. Dismemberment is a kind of a lesson that you learn in the process, because we haven't planned that actually. We planned to have several, let's say, dismemberment elements, like cutting off heads, like basic things, like cutting off heads, like hands, like. But then, when our director played it, and when we played it, more and more, it came to our attention that it's actually one of the coolest elements of the gameplay. And since we haven't had any like space in the plan, any time for creating additional assets, that was quite of a pickle. Like, do you do a feature that is so cool, but it wasn't completely planned, and you risk delaying the game again and crunching even more, or you're not doing it? And the answer is, what's your goal? If your goal is to fit the budget and to fit the time, then of course you need to resign. If our goal was to hit 90 plus, regardless everything else, just like Machiavelli style, just like goal and nothing else matters, then you need to do this feature. So we ended up with creating a lot of assets for many monsters and many crowd characters, and I wanted to show you how we cheated on that as well, because it was difficult to actually fit. Oh yeah, I will be able to stop it. It was difficult to fit all of those assets again within the game. So since we have like hundreds of different crowds, and they have hundreds of different randomizations and colors and, you know, mixes and armors, etc., how you deal with this amount of dismemberment. So I said that you need a body for each and every one of them. You need also a dismemberment for each and every one of them. So we figured out a way that if you use a lot of blood, you don't see colors, because everything is red. So, for example, when she is cutting him in half, first off, he's missing the other half, like right off the bat. She just cut him in the belly, right? And he's missing the other half, so it doesn't make any sense. But it's so quick that you usually don't see it, and then you can notice that his blood is even like under his jacket, which is quite weird, because if you're cut in half and you're bleeding out, right? You probably get your shoes dirty or something, but not the whole thing. Like, you would really need to do some crazy shit to actually cover all your legs in blood. So it wasn't very realistic, but then it was cool, and so it worked, and it was cheap, because then we decreased the amount of assets needed exponentially with this trick, and still we somehow pulled it off. Okay, let's move further. Hair and fur. That is something that I wouldn't recommend to have, but all in all, it went pretty well, especially because the character art department is not programming, so it's I wouldn't say that difficult, but it doesn't spawn so many bugs, because we actually finished our backlog much earlier than the programming guys and the guys responsible for playing this game on multiple platforms and being optimized. So we still ended up with some time at the in the early 2015. So while everybody were just like fixing bugs, we sat around, played the game, and could improve it even more. So we cooperated with NVIDIA on that, and as I said, Hair was the most expensive thing to do, and NVIDIA Hair was also not that easy actually to have, but it was only on the PC, and you can see on the theme that it wasn't looking perfectly. It was kind of a boldish kind of effect at the beginning, and we had some issues, like for example this wolf on the right, it doesn't have a full nice fur while standing in the shadow, for example, or not this one, or Geralt. He has a very like macaroni style kind of hair at some point, which begged us to differ actually whether we should use this technology at all. So it took a lot of tweaking to actually pull it off, but it went pretty well at the end. So you can see here the comparison on the Griffin. So it's moving better, it's looking better, okay, but yeah, it required a lot of tweaking to actually made it that, because the technology was very, very young, and if you're adopting some solution that is just out of the box and just fresh and not being polished yet. For example, with Ice Giant, we had those talks with NVIDIA about whether or not he should have a nice, like, L'Oreal commercial kind of hair, or whether he should, like, since he's living in a cave, he should be like more grumpy and everything. So you can imagine like guys talking through mails about hairstyles of different monsters, how they should look and how they shouldn't look. Two professionals talking. Okay. Quest items. That's something that we left to the very end, and it also was underestimated, because if you have hundreds of quests and each of them requires some item, it is very difficult to manage, because it's a kind of a micromanagement thing to do. The description is rather scarce. So for example, you have a bottle of wine that was broken and there's a spot on the floor. You can't imagine how much interpretations in that item. So we did that like 3 times, because somebody was, the guy was just like, did the bottle and was a spot, like a round spot. No, it's wrong, because the guy was running, so it should be, the slat should be like longer. All right, so redoing this asset. And then, yeah, there should be a footprint in it. Oh man, so redoing it again, because there should be footprints in the wine or something. We had the same issue with eggs, for example, scrambled eggs, like here. How well do you want it done, or how and this is actually something that didn't went into the game, because if you're doing quest items and the quest changes, then your whole work is going to the trash. We had also like fun items, like sculpts, for example, or drawings of a little child. So somebody needed to draw like a 5-year-old or something. But the lesson here is to have a very specific description, or to make your artists actually cooperate like individually with the quest designers, because the description sometimes can be misleading. Even though it is rather clear, it is still better to actually know the quest and what is it about. And some companies, you just like, artists are just receiving a task of doing this sword, and they are doing this sword, and they don't know the story, and they don't know, for example, that it should be rusty or not new in some way. And that comes up when you are actually reviewing the item later on. And censorship, that is something that Central Europe doesn't bother with, thankfully, but other countries do. So for example, in Japan, you cannot cut the guy in his belly, and you cannot have guts. That's weird, but we needed to find a way how to actually substitute that. So for example, each and every gut we substituted with bones or like an empty entity, for example, and try to replay all the quests and try to ask ourselves. And for example, what's important, if you have in a script that the guy is, because it's a detective game, the guy is analyzing the corpse and he sees, oh yeah, the guts are out, and you are in censorship Japan and you don't see the guts. It's like, no, they aren't. Like, something is wrong here. The trick, what we did with the censorship of covering breasts and other pubic area, was just to burn it on the textures. So we had a generic women body textures, when we just burned, we just changed the textures, and the build system just saw the end of the name of the file, and it substituted the file and used the file that was censored instead of the file that was basic in this build. Sorry. So, in summary, we sold a lot of copies, 6 million in 6 weeks, then we passed, I think, like 10 million so far. We passed this review score that we had. We received a lot of awards for it, also even this year for the expansion packs. I have a slide here from 2015, but we also got some golden joysticks this year for the expansion pack. And we were the most talked about and commented game of 2015, which is something that we are very proud of. We did 2 expansion packs. The funny thing about it is that during the development, the team wasn't so sure about the story in both expansion packs, in the first one and the second one. But eventually it went well because we received some awards for it. And this is how we look, more or less. There are a couple of hundreds of us right now in Warsaw and Krakow, and we are still hiring more people because we need to finish one game which you probably know about, Cyberpunk 2077. All right, thank you.